Hello Internet, my name's Ben and today we're going to talk about Syria. Syria's going through a pretty awful civil war right now and we'll get to that, but first some geographical and historical context. So Syria is located here in an area classically known as the Levant. First there were Assyrians, then there were Muslims, then some Crusades, then Mongols, then Ottomans, then a French mandate, and then all of a sudden in 1946 there was this independent country called Syria. After independence, the Ba'ath Party quickly became the dominant political party in Syria. You might recognize the Ba'ath Party as the political party of Saddam Hussein. What you might not know is anything else about the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party is a Middle Eastern political party based on secular pan-Arabism. See, this is the Arab world, and these are some random lines drawn at by Europeans because Europeans love drawing lines on maps. Lots of Arabs thought this was all BS, and the Ba'ath Party was very popular during the Cold War as an alternative to the USA-USSR dichotomy. Lots of Arab countries jumped on the Ba'ath Party train at some point, and they're pretty easy to pick out because they all have flags that look like this, or have the Eagle of Saladin as their coat of arms. Now, one thing the Ba'ath Party is historically not good at is sharing power. Like, for instance, Saddam Hussein was in power from 1979 until the US invasion in 2003, and in Syria, President Hafez al-Assad was in power from 1971 until his death in 2000. Then he was succeeded by his son, Bashar al-Assad, who won the presidential election in 2000 in a landslide. Mostly because he ran unopposed. Now, the people of Syria found this single-family rule of their supposed democracy problematic. Additionally, the al-Assad family had a pretty lousy human rights record. So in 2011, emboldened by the Arab Spring, the Syrian people peacefully protested, calling for al-Assad's removal. Al-Assad took this poorly. He sent in the Syrian army to deal with the protesters, and by deal with, I of course mean massacre. A sizable portion of the Syrian military refused to fire on the unarmed civilians and defected. These soldiers formed the core of what would later be called the Free Syrian Army, one of the largest armed factions of the Syrian rebellion. At this point, foreign fighters started flooding into the conflict, and regional stakeholders started giving military aid to both sides. Then in 2012, hearing that there was a civil war available, the Kurds in northern Syria got in on the fighting, hoping to carve out an autonomous region in northern Syria for themselves. This three-way civil war went on with fairly little international attention until early 2013. In February and March, reports of chemical weapons use started leaking out of Syria. Some reports claimed they were being used by the rebels, and some reports claimed they were being used by the Syrian government. This all escalated to an unprecedented level on August 21st. There was a sarin gas attack in the rebel-controlled areas of Damascus that killed at least 1,200 people. It's alleged that this attack came from the Syrian military and intentionally targeted civilians. This is definitely the consensus among most of the international community, but there are certain countries that deny the truth of these allegations, like the Syrian government, and Russia, and Iran, and certain parts of Tumblr. So now to the slightly more pressing issue, what should the US do about Syria? So yeah, I think there are plenty of self-evident reasons not to get involved in a land war in Asia, so I'm only going to take the time to spell out one. So all wars, and especially civil wars, are complicated and messy, but this one is like extra strength complicated. Seriously. Here's a list of all the groups that are fighting for or supporting the Syrian government. And here's a list of the groups supporting the rebels. Here's a list of radical Islamic militants who generally fight against the Syrian government, but also sometimes fight against the rebels. And here's a list of the Kurdish separatist factions. Now that's a lot of different groups with a lot of different and conflicting ideologies, and all these groups have blood on their hands. This isn't to say that there are no good guys, just that every group of good guys is allied with lots of groups of bad guys too. And saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend is great in the short term, but it occasionally comes back to bite us in the ass. Like, yep, that happened. So now for some reasons for the US to get involved in Syria. Reason the first, US strategic interests. So the geopolitical reason to get involved is that the Syrian government is an ally of Iran and Russia, and the Syrian Civil War could be used as a proxy war between the US, Iran, and Russia to see who's going to become the dominant power in the region. If the US supports more moderate rebel groups, and they win, it would cement the US and her allies' place as the hegemonic power in the region. This line of reasoning is problematic to me for two reasons. For one, I'm not that big of a fan of the clash of civilizations model of political science, and second, Syria's been an ally of Russia and Iran for decades, and it's never seemed to bother us before. So on to reason the second as to why the US should get involved in Syria. The Syrian Civil War is a humanitarian disaster. This is true. More than 100,000 people have been killed in Syria since 2011. More than 2 million have fled the country to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. Seriously, Iraq. Imagine how bad things have to be in Syria for people to be fleeing into Iraq. One of the problems with this is that if the US is going to intervene, it's most likely going to do it with limited strikes with like cruise missiles and smart bombs, etc. And it is very difficult to deal with a humanitarian crisis with smart bombs from 30,000 feet. What you really need for a humanitarian crisis is boots on the ground, and the US and the international community are probably not willing to do that. One of the other obvious problems with this line of thinking is that there are unfortunately lots of worse humanitarian crises out there on the planet, and the US hasn't gotten itself involved in any of those, so what makes this one so special? So lastly, reason the third, to enforce international law. This argument is actually pretty interesting. On the one hand, having international law is really important for like global trade and international cooperation, etc. And using weapons of mass destruction like chemical weapons is pretty much the biggest breach of international law you can have. But on the other hand, it's important to consider who gets to decide when those laws have been broken, and who gets to decide what the right response is. Now, the obvious answer for us in the West is the UN, but because Russia's an ally of Syria, they're gonna block any UN action. Furthermore, the UN is made up of sovereign nations, and if they don't want to use their militaries to enforce international law, do those laws just not get enforced? And if so, what's the point of having them? Are they really even enforceable laws? And should the punishment for breaking international law be that another country gets to bomb you and then call no backsies? These aren't rhetorical questions. In fact, the debate over what to do in Syria brings up lots of non-rhetorical questions. How far should the US go to maintain its power globally? What responsibility do we have to intervene in humanitarian crises or punish violations of international law? These aren't easy questions for us to answer, and they're not likely to go away anytime soon. So what's the right thing to do in Syria? I don't know, but thanks for watching.